College football nerds got a little bit of a special episode for y'all. It, I think, merits discussion when the greatest coach in college football history hangs up his coaching whistle. And I've got Nerd Josh here with me. We're going to talk about it. Not a lot of X's and O's to talk about, not a lot of game strategy to talk about. We're just going to talk maybe Saban's career and potential replacements. There's some news coming out right now, at least a lot of smoke about Dan Lanning. So we're going to get into that. But, Josh, just to get this started, you know, there's one side, there's one camp that says this has been in the works for a while, but, you know, this is kind of like the broken clock thing. People have been calling for his retirement or leaving Tuscaloosa since he showed up. So at some point, the offseason rumor mill had to be correct. And then there's another camp that says players didn't know, coaches didn't know up until minutes before the, I think, 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock meeting this afternoon in Tuscaloosa, players team meeting. Nobody knew. And then there's people that are on Twitter that are saying that Alabama's already got their, guy lined up to replace Nick Saban. I know we can't say for sure because the information isn't out there yet. But in your mind, does this feel kind of abrupt, or do you think this was in the works for a while?
I think it was in the works at some level for a while. I've heard scattered reports on, as you said, whether people did or didn't know. And we're both from the area, and as I think people know, there's certain schools that I've got more sources at than others, and this is one of them. It seems like there was a small circle of people that was at least aware that this was a possibility, is what I'll say, late in the season. And there were people talking about, I think Saban's actually going to leave or whatnot. It had gone around the rumor mill. And as you said, it happens every year, so no one takes it particularly seriously. And the people I talked to that had heard that from other people didn't take it particularly seriously. But I actually think there probably were people that knew. And the thing is, if people knew, then it wasn't that abrupt. At the very least, it was a conversation that had been started. And I think the reality is that from what little I've heard in the early reports, I think Nick Saban had already made the decision that he was going to step down at the end of the year, however the championship went. It's actually interesting, Daniel, because I was on a radio spot for Tuscaloosa Sports Radio on Tide 100.9 this afternoon from 3:15 to 3:45, and I had sort of stayed tuned in to see if there were any callers that commented on anything that we talked about or anything like that, just on the background while I was working. And then the news broke while I was listening to the next guest on the radio show. So it's just kind of a wild day and a wild situation. But knowing some people in that community, it does seem like at least some people probably did know. But again, there's so many rumors every year that I don't know that you'll ever completely suss it out. People are going to say they knew, and nobody's ever going to be able to prove it. But I do think regardless of what happened, it was definitely a small circle of people that knew what the situation was. And I think, Daniel, the interesting thing to me, kicking this off a little bit, is the conversation about why he retired, because the commentary on that is pretty universal. Everyone I've talked to, everyone that I've heard speak on the radio about it, has all said the same thing, which is that he hates the direction college football is going right now. He went to the NFL. He left in a few years for a reason. People like to say he left the Dolphins and they were failing and he was struggling. That's really not true. I mean, he took over, I think, a 2-win team right at the Dolphins, and they were doing okay. They were about to break even. And the real reason he left is that he didn't have a lot of control over the roster. It was all about drafts, money, all that kind of thing, and he didn't want to deal with it. Well, you have to realize what college football has become, rightly or wrongly, is exactly the sort of thing that he hated dealing with in the NFL. And I know for a fact that he was pretty vocal with a lot of people around him that he hated the direction that college football was heading. And I think the rivals that don't like him that watch this video, if you do, are probably going to say he doesn't like it because it wasn't something that he was going to win. I think Alabama fans are going to take that a different way. But I think the truth of the matter is, just like with the RPO, I mean, Saban has taken everything and adapted. When the NIL stuff really hit, whatever the first NIL cycle was, Alabama, I think, had their best recruiting class in their history. So they've done well with it. I think it's more just the perspective and the attitude and the roster management. One, it's even more of a grind. It's even more chaotic. And two, I do think truly that he liked the player development side. He liked building the roster, building the coaches, and now he no longer really can do that because guys can leave on a whim. He's got a ton of people transferring out because they're not immediately starting. He knows it's going to have to deal with that every year. He's going to have to recruit his own players, and if you have to recruit your own players, then you can't really coach them hard the way you want to make them who you want to be. So I think all that really, really came to a head with him.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of a segue into maybe potential candidates to replace, but I do agree. Like his system and a lot of the guys that have flourished under him, even back in LSU days, were guys that were there for a while. And because he does, especially on defense, is a complex system and it takes a long time to get it, it has been good that he can both develop guys and ride them because that's his style. And college football might be transitioning to a more player-friendly environment, and that takes away one of his not only competitive advantages, but things that he loves about the game, as you said. And so, and I don't want to take it all negative. Like Saban, he did thrive to a certain extent under these, guidelines or rules in the new world. But also, if it was 62-year-old Saban, he'd probably say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's adapt like we did RPO and all these other things. But when you're this loaded and you are aging and you've got grandkids, like you're going to not do the thing you don't really love doing when you could be enjoying time in Miami. So, Josh, this leads us to potential candidates. But before we get there, I asked you a question via text before we got on this show. Is this the biggest college football job opening in college football history? I say it is. What do you think?
I think it probably is. There have been a couple openings that were pretty monumental at the time. The most recent one I would think would probably be Pete Carroll when he stepped away at USC. We kind of forget in view of sanctions and everything else, and there was a cloud under the program. But when they hired Kiffin, that was a program that felt like they could get just about anybody they wanted. You have some other ones like Tressel, and I don't want to belittle it because it was a huge shift when they went from Tressel to Meyer. But even that one, Tressel was an excellent coach, but he wasn't necessarily the sort of monumental, again, multinational title-winning thing that this is. Bear Bryant would be another one from Alabama. Probably was the biggest coaching, movement, I guess, when he abruptly retired and passed away shortly thereafter for Alabama in the early 80s. But when you think about it, I think the era of college football plays a factor in it. The magnitude of the programs, the amount of money, the momentum they have. I mean, Alabama is coming out of really the most dominant stretch of any college football program in the modern history of the sport. And there were some older coaches, if you want to go back pre-1950, and there are probably some Big Ten schools that are raising their hands right now, but I will say the sport was not the same then. It wasn't the same money, it wasn't the same size, wasn't the same impact. So really, I would say mid-75 is the earliest you could look at, or 1980 on, for a time period where a coaching change could be this monumental. And this is, obviously the best coach in that era, maybe the best coach of all time, coming out of the best extended stretch of success of all time at the crux of a major shift in the sport, which a lot of people think is going to be better or worse. And if you follow us, we're probably more on the worse side. I think it's probably the biggest coaching resignation, coaching change really in the history of the sport. And it's pretty interesting moving in to say who's going to actually take his place.
And I would say even with Bear Bryant, who was probably the biggest cult of personality and considered at his time maybe the best college football coach ever, that hire of Ray Perkins, which I think was from the Bryant tree, like it had some fanfare, and his leaving college football was a big deal. But to your point, the sport wasn't national. It was still very regional back then. It wasn't televised the way it is now. You might see your team play on TV a couple of times a year if they were really good, and they had to be Nebraska or Alabama or Notre Dame or Ohio State like that. This is bigger, and there's another reason why this is bigger, because the wrong hire can dramatically change the landscape of college football. The right hire can also dramatically change the landscape of college football in a way that has such big swings that when Alabama went kind of okay after Bear Bryant left, it wasn't that big of a deal, wasn't that big of an impact felt in college football, especially how recruiting works. So right now, Josh, all the smoke.
And
Go
let
ahead.
me say one thing there too with the Bryant comparison. You also have to remember that Alabama had been utterly dominant in the 60s, and they were very successful in the 70s, but the late 70s they did trail off. Bryant's teams had not been particularly good within the few years consistently before he retired. And what is, I think, really notable about this is you have a coach that is retiring on an off year, which for him meant he lost to the national title winner in his last game of the year. And there's an argument that they're the second or third best team in the country that year. And it's been a whole, 3 years since they won their last national title. I mean, there was no fall off when this occurred. So I want to note that too with comparisons to the Bryant era and some of these other ones. Alabama was already kind of falling off a little bit when Bryant retired. That's not the case now. And when you think of all these other situations, Tressel's probably the biggest in terms of inheriting a great situation. USC had the huge specter of sanctions when Carroll stepped down. And so that's a whole other aspect of this, is whoever becomes the head coach at Alabama does inherit an incredibly powerful machine, and also does it at a time where everyone can leave, and there's a 30-day portal because head coach resigned from the football team. So it's both the most stable situation and the least stable situation you could imagine at the same time.
Yeah, Bear Bryant's last year, they ranked number 15, went 8-4, won the Sun Bowl. No, I'm sorry, that was Ray Perkins' first year. Bear Bryant's last year, they were 8-4, the Liberty Bowl. So yeah, there was a little bit of downward swing, and then Ray Perkins in his second year 5-6. So I do think this is different, but I do think that given the nature of potentially turning over half a roster, with the transfer portal being an option now, it's tough because you can't have your coach leave and have that roster locked in and everybody fighting for a job. They can just bolt if they want to. And Alabama's already had a top 5-star wide receiver recruit decommit today. That may be that he's looking around already, maybe that he's just going to wait and see. But there is a potential for a team that's on the top to drop hard and fast if they don't make the right hire. Right now, Josh, the smoke is Dan Lanning from Oregon, part of Saban Tree. There's a flight tracker that's tracked a charter plane from Eugene, Oregon to Tuscaloosa, which might be rare, might happen more than people think. A lot of quote-unquote insiders are saying that Lanning is the guy. I've heard that Sark was given a call. Right now, the short list would be Sark, Lanning, Kiffin, D'Amico Ryans, in my opinion. I don't know that I'm not saying all those are realistic, but Josh, is that your short list? Was there anybody else that should be on that short list?
I think you could maybe add Norvell. It depends on how much of a short list you want to talk about. But that would be the list. And let me say at the onset, and probably by the time this even airs, I think Lanning may be a done deal based on just what I've heard. And I haven't heard anything too specific on this, but just the amount of smoke and the amount of rumors coming in is that Lanning may already have basically been locked in. And I would imagine, knowing the way this would have operated and the fact that Saban's stepping down, Greg Byrne, the athletic director there, his nickname is the Ninja because, wherever he was at here and then before when he was in the Pac-12, has a reputation for finding really high-level coaches and having a constant list and being extremely well prepared for coaching searches and knocking things down very quickly, but in closed circles. And I imagine if Saban was going to retire, Byrne was already aware of it. And if Byrne was aware of it, then they've probably already been working towards it. So I would imagine anyone that they were going to hire at least had already been contacted to see if they had any interest. If not, was already being, already had really accepted the position as it is. But when you go down that list, Daniel, it is an interesting set because I think Lanning had 1 year, it was in, I think 15 or 16, he was a graduate assistant at Alabama, so only 1 year there, but then he goes to coach under Kirby Smart, becomes a co-defensive coordinator under Kirby Smart. his coaching is really running the system that Alabama currently runs from a coach management, system management perspective. That's what Georgia did. That's what he's kind of installed at Oregon. He's used to running a big machine. Been in Oregon a couple years now, which I think is important, and has shown basically that he has the ability to manage that apparatus. The other guy, Sarkisian, I think would be probably the dream hire if he was more available. I don't know that Alabama has the resources to get him if they really want to, unless he just wants to come over. Oil money is a thing, and Alabama doesn't have it. They've got a lot of money, but I don't think they've got enough to bid what they would probably need to bid to get Sarkisian. And Texas is becoming an SEC school, has every resource known to man. And if you're Sarkisian, I'm not necessarily sure that you view that as an upward job. Maybe was a better job, but it's sort of a weird thing of it's a better job when Saban's in that chair. When Saban's not in that chair, then you're just inheriting all the infrastructure, and I'm not sure, booster meddling apart, where that's at. So maybe you'll comment on that in a minute. D'Amico Ryans is interesting because he's only actually making $4 million a year right now in a 6-year contract with the Texans. Obviously being hyper successful, making the playoffs very quickly. Now, there are complications to that. One is that his contract's probably just going to increase if he's successful in any way at the rate he's being. Two, he's never really done recruiting. He's never coached at the college level. That's a different thing. NIL is a different thing. And that leads to the third point with him, which was, we tweeted about it, but I don't know that you'd want to leave an NFL head coaching job. Lane Kiffin is an interesting one. Now, I've heard from way too many sources there was some serious drama when he was at Alabama, and it's more than just not paying attention at the end of the year. Lane Kiffin is obviously a very successful coach. He's done very well at Ole Miss, but he's also very volatile somewhat in his personal life. He has been. I've heard he's matured, but maybe not entirely. Volatile in terms of personality, but he's also volatile in terms of results, which I think is underrated. Norvell's the one that maybe we won't talk about too much, but that's probably the most up-and-comery example. But that's still a guy that had one really good year, and then the guys all left, transferred, what have you, got left with an empty roster. I don't know how much real evidence there is that he can recruit at a sustainable multi-year level versus doing the transfer thing he did last year. But I do think in the consideration, before I let you talk about candidates, Daniel, there are a couple of things at play. One is you need someone that can take the apparatus Alabama has, which is a huge chunk of machinery operating with a lot of different moving parts and can sustain it. You need someone that can actually take the pressure that Alabama has and the level of success, because you have to, you're going to have to live up to a lot of expectations. You're going to deal with a lot of criticism, which I think is founded given the salaries and the expectations for Alabama, what that job is right now. But you also are going to have to be somebody that knows how to deal with the current recruiting landscape, because I do think the times of getting a guy in as a freshman and developing him over 3 or 4 years and starting him as a redshirt junior or whatever are kind of dead. You got to recruit 5 stars at a high level just like you always have, but now you've got to deal with NIL when you're doing that. You have to recruit your own players, and you're going to deal with portals in and out of your program to build on top of it, which means those player relationships and keeping players happy becomes much more important than it used to be. It's probably much more of a grind than it used to be, and it's a different set of problems. And some people probably that have been very successful in college football may or may not be successful in the next few years in the new landscape in view of that. So that's my overview, Daniel. I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts.
Parsing Byrne's words, if what he tweeted was very intentional and dog whistly, the first thing he led with was recruiting, which means if we were to take that at face value, while I think D'Amico Ryans would be a phenomenal recruiter in Tuscaloosa, and he is a player's coach, which is what you need in the modern era of college football, navigating some of the feelings and people willing to bolt, I think he would be great at Tuscaloosa. One, I don't think he's leaving the Texans. I would never leave a solid NFL job for a college job if it were me.
Especially these days, I think college jobs they've gotten a lot worse with the changes to the recruiting schedule and everything dealing with the NIL. It's a worse job than it was 5 years ago.
He's never coached on the college level, so he's never dealt with the machine that you have to manage outside of X's and O's, outside of your staff, the machine of recruiting, re-recruiting your own guys, dealing with NIL dollars and deals and all that. He's never dealt with any of that. So to me, the other thing is Lane Kiffin has not been known to really recruit. Especially lately, he's really leaned heavily on the portal. So I don't know if that means anything, but the real recruiting gem would be Dan Lanning. From that standpoint, I think that there's an opportunity to think that that's the pick. Again, I have no knowledge, and I don't think you have a ton of inside knowledge on this either, but there is so much smoke about Lanning that I think it's worth consideration and discussion, just because, like you said, by the time we release this, it's probably going to be known. Pate said,
and I'll say, I was going to say too, it's interesting because his staff, when you go through and look at it, it's filled with former Alabama guys too. We mentioned Lanning, but LaPoy was the defensive coordinator at Alabama. I was looking at their head football strength and conditioning coach was Wilson Love, who was at Alabama. The assistant head strength and conditioning coach is Shad Williams, who was a former Alabama running back. I mean, I was just going through the staff list, and there are a ton of ties there. So there's a lot of smoke. There's a lot of reason for there to be smoke, and there's probably a lot of connections to cause that smoke to happen. So I kind of do expect probably by the time we hear this, he'll probably be the head coach.
I want to delve a little bit into this discussion, even though it's a little silly and entirely premature. But we've seen big-time coaches bring quarterbacks with them. Dylan Gabriel is headed to Oregon. There's an opportunity there for Alabama to really change the dynamics of what we both thought was a bit of a limitation at quarterback this year and immediately be a contender at that position. That's interesting to me. And again, that's premature, but it's also worth noting, this is really weird. I didn't think we'd get into a Vegas discussion here, but we did. One, he's the number one, the highest odds, best odds, or worse, depending on how you're doing it, to be the next coach in Tuscaloosa. Also, Alabama's odds to win the national championship improved by 50% the second Saban was announced that he was retiring. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
Yeah, there's a few things there. One, the Dylan Gabriel question is interesting. And I don't know the situation there, and partly it's rule-based, but partly it's fact-based. He's probably enrolled, but hasn't practiced, and I don't know what that status means in terms of whether he can transfer again. There's actually a huge other angle that's interesting with NIL, because he's probably signed NIL deals with various groups around Oregon. And I don't know how much he could or couldn't back out of it, whether he'd want to back out of it, what if Alabama would be able to counteroffer. But I do think to me, it'd be pretty clear that if Dylan Gabriel went to Alabama, he would immediately start. In my view, I don't think there's any question that Dylan Gabriel would be the starter over the guys that currently have, unless they improve a lot. I know Milroe was very highly thought of, at least in a lot of media circles. We put out a tweet today. We were talking about sack-adjusted yardage, so you generate like the NFL version of passing yardage where sacks come out of passing rather than rushing. We pointed out that they only had 7 yards per attempt, a little over it when you do that. The sack yardage was crazy, and it's because nobody on that quarterback room really is developed where they need to be. And I think they have a lot of guys with potential. I think Milroe's in that, but Gabriel would give them, the classic like 6-year player that, or 5th-year player, whatever, I forget exactly what year he is, that would know how to run an offense entirely day one. And that's what they don't have. And a lot of the other guys really still need to develop. So I'm not sure where they feel like they'll be at, but it's an interesting question. Also an interesting question, how many guys might actually portal out of Oregon to Alabama. People may portal out of Alabama to other schools. There's going to be probably a number of people that happens to. The top wide receiver in a lot of recruiting circles, Ryan Williams, decommitted, I saw today, being recruited by absolutely everybody. Everybody was joking about, hey, Caleb Downs, you interested in coming to Ohio State right now? So that's all on the table as well. In terms of odds, I will say I saw that tweet which came out of FanDuel. I don't know if I wholly believe it, because the odds I'd seen for the national title had been around 600 for Alabama. That's what they actually are right now under DraftKings. And FanDuel did actually tweet that the odds went from plus 1,500 to plus 1,000, which I think raised some eyebrows. And I don't know if there's some trolling going on there, because that Twitter account does sometimes do some things like that, even though it is an official one. But it may also indicate some of the complexities with what's going on. Maybe Vegas thought Saban might retire, and the odds were set on that. Maybe Vegas is betting their odds this season. You have to remember, it's the odds of winning the championship next season on things like the quarterback situation. Maybe they're saying, hey, we think Dylan Gabriel may actually come to Alabama now, and that radically changes our projection for next year. So even with some of that stuff, I don't want to overreact too much. And I will say all the Vegas groups are going to struggle to set lines because we don't really know how a 12-team playoff is going to play out, like how much it's going to be more of a random chance where no one's odds are greater because, just who stays healthy in the playoff, maybe who ends up winning it. And there's another school of thought which says a team like Alabama gets helped tremendously because it's really hard to miss the playoffs, and all they got to do is get in, and then they win. So I imagine lines are going to take a few years to settle, early lines in terms of who's going to be the playoff champion, because nobody quite knows how the new system is going to favor all that.
So just to kind of wrap it up here, I don't want to go too there's probably going to be time for us to do a postmortem on Nick Saban's career at Alabama. This is a quick, hot take, just initial reaction, potential coaches, discussion. But Josh, there's two statistics, and I'm going to confirm them, and I'll tweet them after I have time to do some digging. I haven't had time. This is off the top of my head, so y'all, if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, but I think I'm right. There's two statistics that really will never be touched ever again, probably, that are related to Nick Saban's career. One is, I believe he only lost from 2008 and on, so not counting the first year where he lost to Law Monroe. From 2008 on, he only lost one game to a team that finished unranked, and that was A&M a couple of years ago. The other statistic, which is even more impressive, is including 2007, where I think they went 7-6 or something like that, 6-7. And no Nick Saban team at Alabama in any year, except for 3 times, played a game where they lost and didn't have a chance to tie the game with their final offensive possession. Meaning they only got quote-unquote blown out, which even then wasn't even blowouts, 3 times. That was, I think, 2008 Utah, Texas this year, and Clemson in the 2018 season national championship game. Georgia beat them by a couple of scores, but Alabama was down by 8 with a chance. I think there was like 4 minutes left in the game with a chance to tie. Oklahoma beat them by 2 touchdowns, but A.J. McCarron fumbled, it was a scoop and score, and and there was like 2 minutes left in the game, so they had the ball with a chance to tie in that game as well. Those two numbers, and they're kind of obscure and they're not hard statistics, but those two things I don't think will ever be reached by any coach ever again. Josh, what do you got as a parting shot on Nick's, not coaching replacement speculation, just an observation about Nick Saban's career at Alabama? Give me something to wrap it up on.
I mean, 201-29 was the final record, spanned multiple eras between the BCS and the playoff, multiple types of recruiting. And I think the thing to me that's maybe equally likely to be unsurpassed is the level of success bordering on domination they had in recruiting in that time period. From 2008 when they signed the top class to, I think, last year they signed the top class. I think they're technically number 2 right now, though that class isn't actually done. They were consistently at the top of college football basically every year but 1 year, I think, when the early signing period was first instituted. And the Alabama machinery and what that program was really a perfect mesh of high-level development, a lot of machinery, a recruiting-rich environment, and coaching staffs that were able to put all that together and create great teams. And I think when we go back and look at some of those years under Nick Saban, and when people have already done this, some of those coaching staffs are probably going to stand the test of time as some of the best coaching staffs ever assembled. I think the 2015 team that won the title, you had Lane Kiffin as the offensive coordinator, you had Kirby Smart as the defensive coordinator, you had Nick Saban as the head coach, but then you get into the assistants in some of those teams, And just I'm doing this off the top of my head, but I'm trying to scroll down right now. Bo Davis, the defensive line coach that just got hired for LSU that everybody wanted. Mario Cristobal was the offensive line coach. Billy Napier, the head coach at Florida, was the wide receiver coach. Tosh Lapoy was the outside linebacker coach, currently the defensive coordinator at Oregon. Mel Tucker was the assistant head coach. What is it, 6 head coaches on one coaching staff? So it's not just, I think, about Nick Saban, but similar to what happened at Alabama with Bear Bryant and a lot of the other, like Schembechler, great coaches. They were great coaches filled with staffs of great coaches. And if I were to say one thing about something that maybe declined, I haven't felt in recent years that Alabama had a coaching staff full of future head coaches. And I think the core of what made them great when they were truly great was that aspect. And as much as Saban's stepping back, probably due to changes in the era, change of the fact that he's 72, probably due to other things off the field, which I don't think anybody really wants to get into. Nothing bad on his part, just the fact that he's getting older and there's a lot of stuff that goes along with that. I think there's also an aspect to it too where they haven't necessarily been able to replace those great coaches with great coaches because it's hard. There's people that don't grow on trees, and it's become difficult. So I'm going to give you a question, Daniel, to end with. The one thing, and it's natural for me to end on something of a slight negative because it's who I am. The one thing that I think really maybe caused difficulty for Saban is that he is such a hard worker and he demands so much of his coaches that it did get to the point where I think a lot of great coaches didn't necessarily want to work in that environment. And I don't want to say that because they were lazy, because I think that's unfair. I think it's just, it was a level of demand that they didn't want to deal with. And there are enough other great coaches, many of which coached under Saban, like Smart and Sarkisian, that are more forgiving for assistant coaches and coordinators and schedule. Not to say they don't work them hard, but I'm not sure they quite do like Saban. And so I do wonder with the next coach, do you actually think that there could be something of a renaissance for Alabama? Because the next coach, while you're going to lose a lot from Saban and who he is and how he runs things, Alabama might actually gain something from the turnover and what may potentially be improvements at the coordinator positions and some of the coaching positions from a change of philosophy and being refreshed. I think the strength in coaching staff, if they merge what they have in Oregon, who's phenomenal, with what's at Alabama, that could be a major factor. Do you think that's something that could end up being kind of a hidden positive from Alabama from this transition?
I think it's possible. I think that whoever they bring in has to win year one, probably with the staff they already have where they're at, and potentially some other players that are currently not players, other coaches that are at Alabama currently. I don't know what this means for Tommy Rees, who I'm actually a lot higher on than a lot of people. And, of course, Steele has already retired. It's a good question, though, because I agree with you. I think that Grubb from Washington turned Saban down. I don't think Rees was his first choice. I think there's been a number of defensive coordinators that he's reached out to, and that's why he had to go young with guys like Tosh, Lupoy, and Pete Golding, because when you're that young and you want to come work for Nick Saban, you'll do whatever, right? So I do think some of the more established coaches weren't going to work for him. One, they're already wealthy and they don't have to. But if you're young and hungry, he was going to make a head coach out of you, but you were also probably going to break some eggs on the field with the team and the coaching decisions you made as a coordinator that cost Alabama being maybe could have been better than they actually ended up being. So I agree with you that point. One other thing that I'm going to say, in addition to those two statistics, was kind of built into what you said, and that's adaptability. Nick Saban proved to be more adaptable to the game than I think anybody. And I just hope that the rumors about health, I'm reading more about it right now as you're talking, are rumors or they're manageable health things, because what you want to do for a guy like Nick Saban and Miss Terry for his wife, you want to see them be able to enjoy them grandkids and enjoy retirement, and not be like Bear Bryant, who, the game was everything to him and he was gone shortly after. Anything else, Josh?
No, it'll be interesting to see where all this pans out. Hopefully this video is relevant by the time we get it posted. But I do think, I imagine you agree with me, I would be surprised if they go more than a week without a coach. And I think 2 weeks would be the absolute maximum. But I would wager money that within 7 days, because especially if there's a 30-day portal that's opening, they're going to have a new coach. They cannot afford to let that sit open. Their whole roster will get poached if they do it. So they're going to move inhumanly fast.
Yeah, my guess, if I had to speculate, is that they've already got their coach. They're trying to give, even though this was kind of abrupt, they're trying to give Saban a little bit of his own time to bow out and get his respect as much as they can do with a truncated timeline. And that's the only thing keeping them from making an announcement immediately. Pate said it was going to be soon. And I think the implication there was a couple of days. So we'll see. All right, let us know in the comments if you think we're right on Lanning, if this is still relevant and they haven't announced yet. Let us know any thoughts you have about Nick Saban, or what's your most impressive statistic about the Alabama, LSU, Michigan State tenures of Nick Saban. Maybe you can throw in a Miami Dolphins stat in there if you want. Who knows what would have happened if he didn't have to settle for Dante Culpepper at quarterback. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.